You're listening to the Precision Shooting Podcast, discussing all aspects of precision and long-range rifle shooting. This episode is brought to you by Projectile Warehouse. Find your perfect projectile. And now, over to your hosts.
Well, hello and welcome to the Precision Shooting Podcast. This is episode number 6. I'm Rusty. With me is Andrew.
G'day, Rusty. How are you?
Good, mate. And also special guest tonight, we have Daryl from Meplat Firearm Services. How are you tonight, Daryl?
Yeah, good, Rusty. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no dramas at all, mate. So we're here to speak about you, and do you want to give us a little bit of a summary about what Meplat Firearm Services offers?
Yeah, sure, Rusty. Meplat Firearm Services does a couple of things. We sell premium projectiles. We stock 2 main brands, which are Cutting Edge Bullets and North Fork Technologies, or North Fork Bullets. And as well as that, we import and export firearms, specifically to customer order. Mm-hmm. So customers that see things overseas that they can't get here, yep, and they want to get, they can order them through us. Also doing a lot of business at the moment, exporting firearms out of Australia.
Right.
Some of them are going to overseas customers, but more so it's people that are moving overseas, mm-hmm, or foreigners who've been living and working here and are taking firearms back with them. Yeah,
right. So when you say you're importing firearms, that's individual sort of stuff, and...
Yep. So they can be anything from collectible firearms to handguns to rifles and shotguns.
Okay.
But it is to customer order.
Okay.
Generally, we bundle them up, yep, and ship a consignment of guns, which works out cheaper for everyone rather than doing it individually. But it's made up of individual orders.
Very good. Cool. And any other aspects?
And we also have a line of big game rifles. Sure. The Bnm Rifles and Cartridges line. Mm-hmm. They're based on a Winchester Model 70, and they come in calibers from 9.3 right up to 500 caliber.
Yeah, right.
So they're
big game dedicated.
That's
stuff.
right. Yeah.
Yep.
They're some of the calibers. There's 13 calibers in the B&M line.
Yep.
And some of them are suitable for Australian game as well, such as Sambar and Red Deer and Buffalo, of course.
Sure.
But also the bigger cartridges are specifically for overseas big game, such as found in Africa.
Sure, absolutely. And how long have you been running this business?
I've been doing this for about 3.5 years now. Okay. So yeah, we've established a bit of a following, and we've got a website which is www.meplat.com.au.
Yep, and we'll certainly put that in the show notes so people can look in there and click that if they're not entirely sure or didn't catch it. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that obviously a lot of people find us just through the website, doing a web search for something. I had a guy from Perth contact me today. Just as I said, he's an American who's been working over here, and he's going back to the US and wants to export a couple of the firearms that he's bought while he's over here.
Yeah.
And I guess sort of the services you offer as far as being able to source and actually bring in specific firearms that aren't carried by Australian distributors is probably a reasonable part of your business, I'm guessing?
It is. Get a lot of inquiries about specific firearms that people want to bring in. Unfortunately, at the moment, one of the big killers is the exchange rate.
Yeah, so it's not so good now, is it?
It doesn't stop us from bringing stuff in, but it's just making everything a lot more expensive than it needs to be. And unfortunately, all the costs that are born in US dollars all get transferred to Australian dollars, and then that total gets subject to GST as well. So it is a bit of an expensive time. When I started the business, we were above parity, and it was a great time to import stuff. Mm-hmm. We've been on the big slope now.
Down.
I mean, I guess everybody is in the same boat, really. If you go into a gun shop and buy any product made in the US, you're going to be in the same situation. So
yeah, that's right, Andrew. But I guess the big gun shops order everything in bulk, or at least the distributors do. So they're importing in bulk because we're doing low volume imports. We don't have the same economy of scale, and the exchange rate particularly affects us. But for a lot of customers,
they're after something very specific for a particular reason.
That's right. If they can't get it otherwise, it's
exactly right.
Good option.
So, and a lot of people have said, "Wow, thanks very much," because this is the only way I've been able to get this in otherwise.
Excellent, mate. I'm pretty keen. You said you talked about the projectiles, and that's probably something that our audience is pretty
Sure.
Focused on. Tell us more about particularly the cutting edge.
Yep.
bullets.
Okay. North Fork primarily sort of general hunting bullets, not long range. Whereas cutting edge, they actually started off making long range precision projectiles because they are themselves long range elk hunters. And cutting edge started off as cutting edge machining solutions. They had a business doing precision CNC machined items, both for the gun industry and also other industries for medical and engineering type applications. But they were hunters and long-range hunters at that. And so they said, well, why don't we start making our own projectiles and see where we can go from there? And so they make a very extensive line of long-range projectiles with high BCs for both target shooting and hunting, as well as their general hunting projectiles.
I guess, I'm sort of aware of the product lines, and I know Rusty would be as well, but could you just sort of give us a bit more information about, say, the basic differences between cutting-edge projectiles and, say, Sierra or Berger or any of the other conventional type projectiles?
Most of the conventional projectiles are a copper cup that's been swaged with a lead core. Cutting-edge bullets are solid CNC machined copper or brass projectiles. Most of their long-range projectiles are copper because copper's a little bit heavier. So you're able to get a shorter projectile for the same weight. They are machined to extremely high tolerances. They're actually optically gauged, and I've seen the machine at cutting-edge bullets that checks with a laser to ensure that from batch to batch, lot to lot, the dimensions are the same for the same projectiles. And obviously they can make extremely pointy projectiles, given that they're CNC cut, and they can also do hollow pointing, but it's all very precisely machined. The other good thing about them is that when you whack their projectiles on a digital scale, you'll find that they they weigh out to the exact grain that they're supposed to be, and it's just constant from projectile to projectile, so they've got very high consistency. Yeah,
and I guess that's an issue for hunters, but predominantly for the longer range precision type shooting, it really comes into its own.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew.
Yeah, it's that sound like a good option. I'm sure they're probably relatively pricey, but I guess if you're getting good product,
they are. There's no doubt about that. But one of the things that's, I suppose, popular with people is that they make quite a large range of weights within given calibers.
Yep.
So people can find the projectile that suits their twist of rifle, and they've also got a few options in the design. There's three basic sorts of long-range projectiles. There's what's called the MTH, which is a match tactical hunting projectile. It's got a hollow point and it can be used for target shooting or hunting. There's the MTAC, which is the match tactical. It's basically the same design. So it's a high BC, low drag projectile, but it's got a solid Meplat. So it's not designed for hunting because it doesn't expand at all. And then there's the laser, which is a sort of a hybrid of their Raptor line, which has got a polymer tip.
Right.
And it fractures, the nose section fractures into 3 blades, so it's got really good terminal performance, but it's got the same sort of shape as the MTAC and MTH projectiles, which is long, streamlined ogive and low drag base.
And I think, Rusty, when you're talking about the price, it's all relative. I mean, they are pricey.
Yeah.
However, anybody that knows about CNC machining, they're not pricey, really. Really, for what you're getting.
Yes.
And I guess
if they're consistent, they got good BCs.
If you're reliant on conventional projectiles, there are a lot of variances. I mean, I've measured and weighed Sierras and Bergers, and they're good, but they're not going to be as consistent as a really well made CNC bullet. So
yeah, that's right.
You guys that are serious, it's negligible, really.
Absolutely. And in terms of using the monolithic projectiles or the single metal projectiles, is there some advantages, and is there some things that people would need to know if they're going to load these projectiles?
I suppose one of the things is there's no issues with concentricity with a monometal projectile. I mean, the better made projectiles like the Burgers, for instance, are going to have quite consistent jacket thicknesses.
Sure.
But if there's any difference at all in the jacket concentricity, then it's going to affect the way that your projectile flies. And with a solid monometal projectile, you avoid any of those issues.
Okay.
Some people say, I've got to be careful with monometal projectiles because I've got a tight bore and they don't have as much give in them as a cup and core projectile, which is true. The CEB projectiles are made a little bit differently. They've got the high BC projectiles have got what's called a seal type band, which is 1 thou over nominal bore diameter. And each side of that, there's 2 little grooves, which are called material displacement grooves, and they allow for the seal type band to flow into those grooves. And the front section of the projectile is basically a bore rider. So they're actually a very, for a monometal projectile, they're actually fairly low friction projectile, given the fact that, they are solid copper.
Yeah, right. And do we need to be aware of something different if we're loading them up? Is there any difference to...
Yeah, with the seal type band, the idea is that you load it just touching the case mouth. You don't want to seat it into the neck of the cartridge and damage it. And there's 2 types or 2 configurations with the high BC projectiles. There's a standard projectile, which is designed to fit within the magazine for the most calibers that the bullet is made for.
Yep.
And then there's a max projectile, which is basically the same shape, same weight, but the position of the seal type band is further back on the projectile, which means that the projectile will seat further out, and it necessitates single loading. But if you're doing precision shooting and you're not, belting off, 5 rounds in 5 seconds, then single loading for many people is what they're doing.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of people have single shot long range actions as well because you get a stiffer action, obviously, without the magazine cutout.
Just one thing I was thinking about these projectiles. How do they conform as far as ballistic coefficient? Do they, could you run a G7, or is there anything specific? Or
yeah, look, there's. I've been reading a little bit about this. The G7, I suppose, standard of measuring BC is the more relevant one to high BC, especially monometal projectiles. The G1 coefficient doesn't do it the same justice. Typically, the BC will be slightly lower for the same weight projectile, and that's simply because a monometal projectile, being less dense, needs to be longer, and with a longer bearing surface, it's going to reduce the BC slightly. So, some people look at BC as the most important thing. This projectile's got the highest BC, or that one has.
Yep.
But it's not the whole...
not the full story.
It's not the full story. And the other thing is you need to match up your, I suppose, BC with the range that you're looking at, or the range segment that you're looking at engaging targets at. Some high BC projectiles only really come into their own beyond a certain distance, and closer than that you'll find that a lower BC lighter projectile with a higher muzzle velocity is going to shoot flatter, may have slightly more wind drift, but may make engaging targets a lot easier with the flatter trajectory.
Yeah, and I guess like any projectile that doesn't conform absolutely perfectly, I mean, the guys that are serious will actually plot their real world data rather than relying solely on a readout from a ballistic program. So
yeah, that's exactly right.
And I guess consistency is well, for me anyway, in a long range projectile, consistent performance is trumps everything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no point having a BC that's higher than everything else if you've got weight variances or ogive variances that basically will cause your accuracy issues to become noticeable.
Absolutely, Andrew. While everyone wants a flat shooting cartridge and a trajectory that's as flat as possible, it's more important to know your trajectory and be able to adjust for it and have that consistent trajectory all the time. And if your group size at the end of that trajectory is smaller, you're better off with a more arced trajectory with a small group size than a flat trajectory with a wider one.
Well, your hit probability will be a lot higher. So.
Absolutely, yep.
That's what we're all chasing. Yeah. So how did you get into shooting? Where did that come from? And obviously now you're to the point where you started your own business in the industry. And tell us about that journey. Yeah,
sure, Rusty. I guess I was one of those kids that was interested in firearms from the moment that they slid out the chute.
Yep.
I was never encouraged by anyone in my family, but all my earliest, childhood drawings were all of battle scenes. I was always interested in the military and in firearms, and that love of firearms and shooting and ballistics has brought me to where I am now. I'm a keen hunter.
Mm-hmm.
I've hunted both around Australia and internationally in Canada and Africa as well. And I suppose that's my primary focus.
Sure.
But in addition to that, I've just got a love of firearms, and also I'm really interested in ballistics and learning more about ballistics. One thing I've always, said about shooting and ballistics is that it can be very, very simple if you want it to be, but the more you look into it, the more and more complex it gets. And if you've got a thirst for knowledge, there's just a constant amount of learning you can do in the science of ballistics.
Well, it just seems, sort of from my observation, that there's always new information coming out. It's what we know about projectile design and terminal performance and exterior ballistics was way more advanced than we knew, say, 5 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Andrew, the other thing is that there's new, I suppose, computer programming that allows modelling. Anyone that's a fan of long range shooting would have heard of Bryan Litz in the US, who's the chief ballistician for
Burger,
thank you. Just had a blank there, but he was also an aerospace engineer, and the testing that he's doing, and the equipment that he's using, and the computer modelling that he's also using to assist in the prediction of results is really good. And I'm reading through one of his books now and learning a lot. And as I said, when you think the trajectory of a bullet is a fairly simple thing. It's an arc affected by gravity and wind resistance. But when you read his account of it, it's there's a whole lot more factors that are coming into play.
Yeah, that's probably a worthwhile point. We've talked about the Bryan Litz books. I know Greg has several times, and we employed one of the setups that he uses, one of the tests that he uses for Greg's cartridge selection. If you are listening, certainly recommend reading any of his books. They're relatively easy to get your head around compared to what they could be like, but they certainly will challenge you with some ideas and some complex problems taken relatively easily. Into fairly standard terms.
I think what he does, Rusty, is for the lay shooter who is not necessarily a mathematician, he breaks it down into layman's terms, but also I found what's really handy is that quite often in a chapter he'll have a summary and say, okay, let's just review what we've talked about, and he'll summarise the key points so that it stays in your mind and makes it easy to understand. So I think they're well written.
Yeah, absolutely worth reading.
Maybe not for the beginner, but if you're an experienced shooter, you'll get a lot out of reading those books, especially if you're into long range shooting.
Absolutely.
Which most of our audience is.
Yeah, that's right.
Funny that. Yeah, cool.
I guess from a sort of a shooting perspective, obviously you just covered how you sort of got into the shooting sport.
Yep.
With the cutting edge bullets being one of your main items you import and deal with, it indicates to me you have obviously a very good interest in long range shooting, not just your hunting and close range stuff. How did that develop?
Yeah, look, I guess I've got interest in many aspects of shooting. Admittedly, I haven't done the amount of long range shooting that I'd like to do.
None of us have at all.
No, I mean I've built a dedicated long range rifle in 375. It's got a 33 inch barrel. It's got the Schmidt and Bender PM2 scope. It's got an imported gain twist barrel, an imported trigger, an imported stock. Finding the time.
Anyone would think you're in an import business, wouldn't
Well,
they?
that's right.
Yeah.
Handy that. But it's just finding the time to get away to the places where you can go and put a rifle through its paces at long range is increasingly difficult in this busy life.
Yeah, it's one of those skills that you can have all the paper knowledge in the world, but until
Absolutely.
you actually employ those skills in the real world, it can be quite challenging. So.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can certainly say that, especially in the last 12 months, clearly the number of long-range shooters out there is increasing. There's more people contact me with an interest in obtaining either parts for firearms or firearms that are of a long-range nature, but especially in terms of projectile sales, surprisingly to me, the number of long-range projectiles that I'm selling is probably greater than the number of general hunting projectiles that I'm selling now. And that certainly wasn't the case when I started the business. Most people were going for the standard sort of short-range projectiles, good for sort of, up to 300 or 500 metres. But lately, especially in 375, followed by 338, those long-range high BC projectiles are selling really well.
What do you think's driving that change towards the interest in long-range shooting?
That's hard to say. I guess there's probably, a lot of it's probably influence from the US, where long-range shooting is becoming more and more common, and as it's talked about more in shooting circles, and as there are more and more firearms and more technology, as you said, things are improving technologically all the time with long-range shooting. I think it's only natural that it will gain a bigger following, and there seems to be more people looking to build long-range firearms, especially in, I think initially it was long-range 308, 300 Magnums, and the like, but now certainly 338 and 375 seem to be the bulk of the projectiles that my customers are interested in.
Do you sell many of the smaller caliber, like sort of under 30 cal line of projectiles?
Actually, CB make sort of long-range high BC target projectiles in 22, 243, 277, 264, in a range of calibers, really. It's not just, 308, 338, 375. And I do get some customers, asking for 6.5, 277s. Less common. Some of them may be F-class shooters, but certainly for the people that are really extending the ranges, 338 and 375 are the most common and most popular. I've recently started selling to a customer in WA who is consistently shooting out to 3Ks, and he's been doing that with a 338, surprisingly, and is now building up a 375 and ordered several hundred projectiles from me so that he can extend past that 3K barrier.
Go beyond that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've covered previously in some of our other podcasts the maybe not quite extending that far, but the interest in long range out to say 1,500 yards. The evolution of starting out with 308s, 300 Win Mags, and the bigger calibers dominating, and then as people have sort of learnt and I guess the sport has evolved, we've gone down to the smaller calibers. Sort of hence I asked about the smaller caliber stuff.
Well, actually, it's interesting. The guys from CB recently competed in a shoot called the King of 2 Mile, which was held, I think, down in where was it, Texas, down south in the US, and that was a shoot that was open to international teams. The Accuracy International team were there. The US F-Class team were there. There were a number of, I think there were 25 teams from 4 countries, as well as a lot of US agencies. And Dan Schmitko, who's the president of CB, actually won that shoot, which was
not a bad effort.
Not a bad effort at all.
Good for business.
It was. He was shooting a 416 caliber
with CB projectiles.
With CB projectiles.
That's good then.
But surprisingly, they said, there was people shooting 338, 375, 416, 50 caliber, and yet one of the guys that was really competitive was an individual who was shooting a 300 Win Mag, and he had a novel barrel tuning method, and he was actually getting really good results out to all but the longest ranges, and he surprised a lot of people.
I bet.
So
absolutely.
it just, it brought to the fore that with the right understanding and technology, some of these smaller projectiles with lower recoil and smaller charges can still hold their own out to quite significant distances.
Yeah, I guess we've been tracking a lot of the precision rifle series in the US and what they do, and I guess those smaller calibers have become dominant because they're not worried about terminal performance, and they're more interested about keeping the picture on the target, so that they're not losing.
And a lot of those stages are speed orientated, multiple targets, whereas the extreme long range stuff, it's more the emphasis is on hitting the target, not multiple targets, and
sure.
So it's a little bit, it's a fair bit different, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good. Now, I've been reading you put an email out, and certainly suggest people jump onto Daryl's website and sign up to his email, because not only does he tell you about products and things going on, but also includes some technical information in his emails, which is very well thought through and researched. Daryl, I'm interested to hear what's been some of the most interesting findings that you've come across in your research there.
Yeah, look, I put out a quarterly newsletter. Obviously, I like to keep customers informed of new products and so forth, but I don't like it to just be a sell, buy type arrangement. So I try and put a bit of technical information on things that I've learnt and things that I think could be helpful to people. Recently, I've been reading a book, and I recommend it to anyone that's into hand loading, and probably a lot of, or most of your listeners would be.
Absolutely.
It's a book by Mick McPherson called Metallic Cartridge Handloading, The Pursuit of the Perfect Cartridge. I've read a lot of reloading books, and occasionally, you glean a bit of information that you didn't know before. I learnt so much stuff from this book. It's unbelievable. This character, Mick McPherson, who's an American, has delved into every aspect of hand loading, of projectiles, of cartridge cases, of primers, done all sorts of tests, worked with some large companies in the US, propellant makers, primer makers, to do some of these tests, and some of the results that he's found have been quite interesting, and I highly recommend that. If you want an education and you want to go beyond scratching the surface with reloading, that book by Mick McPherson, Metallic Cartridge Handloading, is an absolute gem.
Well, by the sounds of it, I think that would be very appealing to most of the listeners that are interested in the precision and long range. It's obviously, by the sounds of it, not just a standard reloading manual. So
I presented something recently about hand loading at one of the SHOT Expos, and I took some information from one of the graphs, which is all about primers and pressures and velocities, and it showed how keeping all else the same apart from the primer. He had a couple of cartridges that he used. I think 3006 was the main one, but he substituted the primers and showed that while from the lowest velocity to the highest velocity was only 100 feet per second, the pressures were over 10,000 psi from the lowest to the highest. So you took
from just changing primer.
Yeah, changing the primer. So you by substituting the primer, you can take a safe load and go well over the safe working pressure, and obviously that's going to have impacts also on your consistency and point of impact if you're changing brands. So once you find a good load, then stick with all the components just as they are, and don't think that something similar like substituting a primer brand or type won't have an effect, because it definitely will.
Yeah, I mean, we noticed that, Sam. It was a little while ago now, in 300 Win Mag, just doing tests using large rifle primers versus Magnum primers, and it's really quite noticeable. You wouldn't, we had the opposite of what we thought would happen.
Yeah, the standards gave a much lower standard deviation.
And higher velocity. So.
And higher velocity, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
that was just within one brand.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it didn't change brands at all.
So, and he also, in that particular study, he used brands that were current manufacture, and also the same the same primer that was from 10 years previously, and found that there were different results as well. So, yeah.
Amazing. Nice. And any other stories from the research you've done for your technical articles?
Oh, look, I suppose that there's been a few things. A lot of the stuff has just come from, I suppose, my own learning and experimentation, seeing what works and what doesn't, and trying to, help people with sort of advice that has worked well for me over the years.
Yep.
There's a lot of simple things that, especially people that are getting into reloading and shooting and are sort of still in their early years, can, I suppose, jump a few steps and learn the quick way rather than learning the hard way.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
very good. Is there any common myths that you've sort of uncovered that you wish to dispel through your shooting and testing and projectiles or anything?
I had I was at an Adelaide gun show recently, and a young lad who just got into shooting came up and was talking to me about firearms, and he said something which I've heard a number of times, and he said, well, accuracy's got a lot to do with barrel length, hasn't it? And I sort of had to point out to him, well, actually no, barrel length and accuracy have got nothing to do with each other. The only time that's true is if you're using iron sights on a firearm. If you've got a longer sight radius, you're going to reduce your sighting error. But the actual accuracy of the barrel, has nothing to do with it. Often a short, stiffer barrel is going to have less effect on bullet dispersion because you get a tighter sort of barrel harmonic, and you don't get the same whip effect that you'd get in a longer, thinner barrel. So they're stiffer and tend to group projectiles much tighter. The same lad also said to me, he said, I've been told that I need to use heavy projectiles because I've got a high rate of twist. And I said, no, not quite. I said, you're certainly able to use heavier projectiles because you've got a faster twist, but it doesn't at all mean that you need to use them. I think a lot of people fall into some holes with rates of twist. Obviously, the most important thing about a projectile is within a given caliber is going to be its length.
Yes.
The length tends to determine what twist rate you're going to need. The longer the projectile, the faster the twist is going to be. One of the, I suppose, commonly held beliefs for many years is that while you want to stabilise a projectile, you don't want to over-stabilise it because you want it to trail or to trace properly at long range, which is where the nose follows, or the tail follows the nose, rather than the projectile as it starts coming down in its arc, ending up sort of nose high. And that's sort of dispelled now. And people like Bryan Litz have shown that if you stabilise a projectile more than it's actually required, it actually tends to have or give the projectile greatest gyroscopic stability over the whole length of its trajectory, and you do tend to actually get better results. So having a faster twist than you require is probably actually a good thing, especially if you're a long-range shooter.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my experience, you can often run a light projectile through a faster twist barrel. You're not usually going to be using that light projectile at long range anyway. You might be using it for, closer range varmint shooting, for example, and not really stretching it out. So it's sort of a moot point, really. I mean, I've noticed accuracy differences. Some rifles with fast twist barrels don't seem to shoot the light bullets accurately, but they'll shoot a different brand of projectile accurately. So it's I think probably a common misconception that you can't shoot light bullets in fast twist barrels.
Sure.
So,
and I suppose to that point too, a common misconception people have is that all bullets should shoot to the same point of impact, especially if they're the same weight. And the reality of it is that you can zero a rifle with one projectile and have it perfectly zeroed. You change brands and bullet shape slightly, and that projectile will not only shoot higher or lower, but it will actually shoot off to the left or the right. I had a customer who was quite perturbed that the CEB projectiles that he was shooting didn't print in the same place as his regular load. And I was trying to explain to him, well, it's not that they're not accurate, it's just that for that projectile you need to adjust your point of aim. And I've, when I've done load development, one thing I notice is that when you start off with a load and progressively increase the powder charge as you're looking for that that node in accuracy, projectiles print not only lower to higher but also tend to often go, say, left to right across a page diagonally. So you do need to adjust your point of aim when you're either substituting projectiles, your point of impact when you're substituting projectiles or charges.
Yeah, absolutely. We had that in the 5-gun comparison we did 3 Southern shooters, where one of the types of ammo, we didn't change point of impact at all. We didn't change point of aim at all. The point of impact danced around, and one ended up off the page completely, which happens. Yeah, and you certainly do need to do that. But I guess if you don't know that, you don't know it.
That's right.
Until you work out why it's not working for you.
Exactly
why you keep
right.
missing those targets. Yeah.
And I guess a lot of the misconceptions or not complete truths regarding shooting stem from the fact that a lot of guys write for gun magazines and that sort of thing that have quite limited experience and limited research in a field, so they tend to regurgitate things, which unfortunately sort of continues the myths, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Andrew. And quite often, people have beliefs that they've held because someone's told them years ago that this is the way it is, and they've always just accepted that as as a truth. Whereas if you put it to the test, you soon find that it falls over.
That's, I think, one of the things I like about Bryan Litz. He always says test everything, even what he tells you, test it anyway.
Yeah, that's right. As Ian Thompson, who was a noted DSTO ballistician who did a lot of writing for the Sporting Shooters Association, Australian Shooter magazine, he said to me, whenever you do an experiment, he said, you always measure something. It doesn't always work out to be exactly what you thought, and the results that you get aren't always the results that you expected.
Sure.
But that's why you do the experiment, to see the truth of the matter, and then you sort of need to understand why the results that you're seeing have come about, and that leads to greater understanding and obviously more accurate understanding as well.
Information, yeah, absolutely. One other question back on the projectiles I was going to ask you. I know, and I'll probably get the name wrong, but I think it's the ESP Raptors from CEB.
Yep.
They're a really unique type of projectile, and while they perhaps may not line up exactly with the precision and the long-range sort of stuff, I find them very intriguing, probably worthwhile talking about.
Yeah, sure, okay. So the ESP stands for Enhanced System Projectile. They stem from the original flat-base Raptors, but they've got the same heel shape as they have on the nose or the Meplat.
Yep.
So the angle is the same, and when you turn them around, basically they look the same top and bottom.
Okay.
One end has a hollow point in it.
Yep.
And you can either put a polymer tip in it to give it a high ballistic coefficient, or you can shoot it as a sort of flat nose hollow point. And the other end is a solid. So they actually have the advantage of actually being able to be used in 3 different ways. They can be used as a blunt-nosed expanding projectile.
Yep.
They can be used with the polymer tip for longer-range shooting, or
Sure.
they can be turned around and shot as a solid. And in testing, and kids don't do this yourselves at home, but in testing they have actually been fired as solids into the bullet box, and the same projectiles have been recovered and then turned around and fired as a hollow point, they function just the same. And
of course, there's going to be a POI difference, as we just discussed.
There will be a slight POI difference if you're shooting with a ballistic tip.
Sure.
But there shouldn't be too much, given that they've got the same nose shape effectively, and if you're using the same charge, then they'll be very similar.
But I guess it's worth noting that those particular projectiles are more of a premium hunting projectile rather than a long-range projectile.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think for the given application, it's a very versatile choice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, anyway, they intrigued me. I've seen them and play with them and haven't shot one yet, so I'm very intrigued by that sort of versatility they give you.
The reality is most people that would shoot an ESP projectile are going to use it as a hollow point, and not as a solid. But for some people, if they want to use the smaller caliber projectiles as a solid for whatever reason, whether they're pelt shooting and they want to minimise damage, or whether they need deep penetration, they can use the one projectile in two different capacities. The only thing that differs, I suppose, is the location of the driving bands, because it's a projectile that sort of runs on the bore, and it only has 3 or 4 driving bands that engage the rifling. The projectile will seat slightly differently. It's made to seat deeper with the hollow point, so that you can use it with the tip if you want, and further out with the solid.
But I think quite a versatile projectile on a big game rifle, for example. You could have the first one would be a hollow point or tipped, and then solids. Yeah, that sort of thing. So,
but for the serious big game, the flat base Safari Raptors and Safari Solids are basically match projectiles. So they are exactly the same in profile. One is a solid, one is a hollow point. They've got a flat base because generally they're used for closer range encounters, and you work up a load for the solid, and then you use that same load in your hollow point configuration, and they'll basically shoot to the same POI out to 100 metres or so. So they're very effective.
Now, you talked about driving bands before, and that's something we see on the monolithics. Are you able to explain what they do and why they're there?
Yeah, sure. As I said before, a cup and core projectile has a malleable lead centre, and so it's got a bit more give in it. So when the copper is engraved by the rifling, it can compress it a little bit and allow for the bullet to squash a little bit to conform to the rifling. Because the CB line are monometal, they're either brass or they're solid copper. They've either got, as I said before, a seal-type band, or the brass projectiles, with brass being a little bit harder than copper, they run on driving bands. So most of the length of the projectile is only touching the lands, and the only part that's actually going into the grooves are the rifling. The grooves of the rifling are the driving bands, so it minimises barrel friction. And testing in the US by Bnm Rifles and Cartridges have actually shown that the barrel strain caused by the CB Raptor sort of series of projectiles is actually lower than it is with just standard cup and core projectiles. So they've used strain gauges, especially on double rifles, which are often got fairly thin barrel walls. It's long been held that you can't shoot monolithic solids in double rifles because they put too much pressure on the barrel. Well, that's certainly not the case with the CB line, because those driving bands alleviate the pressure, but still give you a complete gas seal.
And I imagine could be, foul less than a conventional cup and core projectile, a lot less surface, bearing area.
That's exactly right, Andrew. They do foul less. You've got a much reduced friction, especially given the fact that the I suppose long for weight monolithic projectiles have got a long bearing surface. By reducing the amount of bearing surface that's actually being engraved, you greatly decrease the amount of fouling as well. Yeah.
So having that less bearing surface, does that affect your velocities at all?
Well, potentially it means that you can drive the projectiles faster. You tend to have slightly less pressure, although especially like brass, it's harder than copper, but it's got a higher lubricity, so it actually, I suppose, doesn't have the same degree of friction on the bore surface once it is engraved. So potentially, you can actually drive these projectiles very fast, and unlike I suppose some lead core thin jacketed projectiles, which if you drive them too fast, they can actually spin apart. With the CB, or in fact any monolithic projectiles, you can drive them as fast as you want, and they'll never come apart.
I guess, Rusty, probably some of the more specific projectile-related discussions, we may well look at future podcast solely dedicated to projectile selection and all the design issues and that sort of thing. So
yeah, I think it'd be good to get Daryl back and expand on projectiles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it would be good. You happy to do that, mate?
Be my pleasure, Rusty.
Very good. Well, guys, we're that might do us for this podcast. So, Daryl, thank you very much for coming in.
No worries, Rusty. Thanks,
great having you here,
having me.
Sharing your knowledge. Guys listening, we're going to put up some information how to get in contact with Daryl and his business and how you can jump on there. Make sure you sign up to the newsletter. They can do that from your website.
Yep, they can do that from the homepage.
Yeah,
so on the sidebar there.
Jump on there, and when those technical articles come out every quarter, certainly read up on them, and we may even announce them when they arrive on the show as well. So that would be good. Unless we got any last questions at all, Andrew?
No, nothing that will involve a quick answer. So we'll delve a little deeper into the projectile specifics at another episode. But thank you very much for coming in, Daryl.
No worries. Thanks, Andrew.
Great, guys. Well, thanks for listening, and stay tuned, and we'll be back.
Thanks for listening to the Precision Shooting Podcast. To continue the discussion, check out our Facebook page. And for more information, head to our website, www.precisionshootingpodcast.com.au. This episode was brought to you by Projectile Warehouse. Find your perfect projectile.